The air at the Hemmings Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late summer dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the bittersweet smell of defeat. It was September of 1968, and another family farm was going under the hammer. I stood near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my Ford pickup, my arms crossed over my chest. I wasn't here to buy land. I had my 160 acres, free and clear, just like my father had left it to me. I was here to watch, to bear witness, and maybe pick up a few spare implements if they went cheap enough. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Fitzwater with a sweat-stained Stetson, was working the crowd like a preacher at a revival. "Look at this piece of bottomland, folks. Black gold. You can grow anything on this 80. Who'll start me at 300 an acre? 300. Do I hear 300? A hand shot up from the front. Richard Sterling. Of course, Rick was the talk of Providence County. He'd come back from a 2-year stint in the city with a pretty wife, a pocketful of his father-in-law's money, and an ambition as wide as the horizon. He stood there in clean denim, his boots looking like they'd never seen a mud puddle, a confident smirk playing on his lips. 300, he called out, his voice clear and sharp. Fitzwater pounced on it. I've got 300 from Mr. Sterling. Who'll give me 3 1/4? 3 1/4. The crowd was silent. No one else could touch that price. Most of us were making do, getting by. We ran on cash, on what we earned the year before. Rick Sterling ran on bank money. He'd already bought the old Miller place last spring, and now he was carving up the Hemmings farm like a Thanksgiving turkey. The bidding was a formality. The 80 acres were his. As the crowd began to mill around, heading over to where the machinery was lined up, Rick spotted me. He strode over, clapping a neighbor on the back as he passed. "Arthur," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Just watching the show?" "Something like that, Rick," I said, my voice low. I didn't uncross my arms. "Shame to see old man Hemmings go under. But that's the way of it. Can't make money running 50-year-old equipment." He gestured with his chin toward the line of tired-looking Farmels and Olivers, their paint faded to a dull patina by decades of sun and rain. "The future is about efficiency, horsepower." He knew exactly what he was doing. He was talking about Hemmings, but he was looking right at me. My main tractor was a 1965 John Deere 4020, a good machine, but already considered old school by guys like Rick. My cultivating and utility work was still done by the 1951 Farmall M my father had bought new. It was a tractor I knew inside and out, every gear whine, every puff of smoke. "That old iron paid its way," I said, keeping my eyes on the auction. Rick chuckled. It was a sound that grated on my nerves, full of condescension. "Paid its way into foreclosure, Art. Look," he said, leaning in a little, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "The bank is practically giving away money. I just signed the papers on a new international harvester, 12F86. Turbo diesel, a cab with a radio. Even air conditioning. I can plow in a dress shirt if I want to. I'll get my fall tillage done in half the time it takes you with that old green relic." He was proud of it, proud of the debt. He saw it as a tool, just like a plow or a disc. I saw it as a chain, each link a monthly payment, shackling a man to the whims of a banker in a suit and a market 1,000 miles away. "The bank's always friendly when they're handing you the pen, Rick," I said. He just shook his head, that smirk returning. "You're a dinosaur, Arthur. You and your dad's old tractors. This is 1968. You gotta get big or get out. You can't do that when you're spending half your time wrenching on junk." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly but felt like a dismissal. "You think about it. The loan officer's name is Mr. Davison. Tell him I sent you." He walked away then, joining the circle of men who were admiring his new vision for the county, leaving me there with the smell of his fancy cologne and the echo of his words. Dinosaur. Junk. I looked over at the Hemmings farmhouse, the paint peeling, the windows like vacant eyes. Mrs. Hemmings was on the porch, a frail woman in a faded dress, watching her life get sold off piece by piece. They'd tried to keep up. They'd taken a loan for a new combine a few years back, but a bad drought and a worse corn blight had put them behind, and they never caught up. The bank had been friendly then too. I turned and walked back to my truck, the auctioneer's chatter fading behind me. I didn't need any parts today. I drove home the long way, past my own fields. The corn was tall and healthy, the tassels turning a dusty brown. The rows were straight. That old 40-20 and a 4-row planter had done their job just fine. My barn was old, but the roof was sound. My house was small, but the foundation was solid. And everything, from the soil under my feet to the tools in my shed, was mine. Not mine and the bank's, just mine. That evening, I was in my shop, the air thick with the familiar scent of grease, diesel, and old steel. My father's tools hung on the wall, each one worn smooth by his hands and mine. The Farmel M sat in the corner, its simple, rugged engine a testament to an era of straightforward design. I ran my hand over its fender, the metal cool and solid beneath my palm. Rick Sterling saw it as junk. I saw it as freedom. He saw his new International as progress. I saw it as a 3-ton steel anchor of debt. Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to stop and ask you folks a question. I want you to be honest. Back in those days, in the late 60s, with the promise of new technology and easy credit being preached from every bank and dealership in the country, whose side would you have been on? Were you the type to bet it all on the shiny new paint, the air-conditioned cab, and the promise of tomorrow? Or would you have stuck with the tried and true, the metal you owned outright, even if it meant more sweat and longer hours? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because back in 1968, in Providence County, the answer seemed obvious to everyone but me. The next few years seemed to prove Rick Sterling right. The world was changing fast. Men were walking on the moon, and tractors were getting bigger and more powerful every season. Rick's new International 1256 was a monster. You could hear its turbo whistle from a mile away as he tore through his fields. He bought a new, wider plow, a bigger disc, a 6-row planter. He was the first in the county to finish planting and the first to finish harvesting. The talk at the co-op and the diner was all about Rick Sterling's efficiency. He was becoming a local legend, the farmer of the future. Meanwhile, I was the farmer of the past. I kept on with my 40-20 and my old Farmel M. And just as Rick had predicted, I spent a lot of time wrenching. In the spring of '71, the 40-20 gave me a scare that almost proved him right. I was dissing the North 40, turning over the corn stubble, when I felt a lurch. The engine was running smooth as ever, that deep 6-cylinder hum filling the air. But the tractor wasn't pulling right. There was a grinding noise from the transmission, a sick metallic sound that went right through the soles of my boots and into my gut. I pushed in the clutch and coasted to a stop. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the hot engine. I knew that sound. It wasn't a simple fix. It was deep inside the guts of the machine. I managed to limp it back to the barn in a low gear, the grinding getting worse with every turn of the wheels. That night, I spread the service manual open on the workbench, its pages smudged with the greasy fingerprints of a dozen other repairs. The diagnosis was grim. Based on the sounds and the way it felt, I was almost certain I'd lost the synchronizers for third and fifth gear in the synchro-range transmission. Fixing it meant splitting the tractor in two. It was a monumental job. For 2 weeks, while Rick was already out planting corn with his new air planter, my 40 coincidental sat in the center of my shop, looking like a casualty of war. I started by draining the fluids, first the engine oil, then the thick, pungent hydraulic fluid, nearly 15 gallons of it. I disconnected the fuel lines, the wiring harnesses, the throttle linkage, the power steering lines, every artery and nerve that connected the engine to the back half of the machine. Then came the heavy work. I used a rolling engine hoist to support the front end and built a heavy-duty stand out of oak timbers to hold the transmission housing. The bolts that held the two halves together were massive, 1.5 inches thick. I had to use a 4-foot breaker bar with a piece of pipe slipped over the end for extra leverage to crack them loose. My knuckles were busted and bleeding, and my back ached in ways I didn't know it could. Finally, with a groan of protesting steel, the tractor came apart. I rolled the front half, the engine, front axle, and radiator away, leaving the transmission and rear end exposed. It was like performing open-heart surgery on a giant. The inside of the transmission was a complex world of gears, shafts, and bearings. And there it was. The synchronizer assembly was chewed up, the brass teeth worn down to nubs, with metal shavings circulating in the remaining oil like poison. A new assembly from John Deere would have cost a fortune, money I didn't have. So I spent 2 days on the phone, calling every salvage yard in 3 states. I finally found a used one in decent shape out of a tractor that had been wrecked in a fire. The parts arrived on a bus a few days later, wrapped in oily newspaper. Putting it all back together was twice as hard as taking it apart. Lining up the splines on the transmission shaft with the clutch plate was a job that required the patience of a saint and the precision of a watchmaker. I had to roll the front half forward and back, 1 inch at a time, making tiny adjustments until it finally slid home with a satisfying thud. During those 2 weeks, the whispers in town grew louder. Heard Art Jensen's 40-20 is split in half in his shed, they'd say over coffee at the diner. Should have traded that thing in years ago. Rick drove by my place once, slowing his shiny new pickup down to get a good look at the dissected tractor in my shop. He didn't stop. He didn't have to. The look on his face said it all. I told you so. My wife, Sarah, felt the pressure too. She'd come home from town with groceries and a tight look on her face. Martha Sterling was at the store today, she said one night, her voice quiet. She was talking about the new drapes they're having made for their living room. Said Rick is thinking of buying a brand new combine next year. I just nodded, wiping grease from my hands with a rag. We've got a roof that doesn't leak and food on the table, Sarah, and we don't owe anyone a dime. She knew I was right, but it was hard. It was hard to feel like the whole world was moving forward while you were standing still, covered in grease, trying to breathe life back into old iron. When I finally got the 40-20 bolted back together and filled with fresh fluids, I climbed into the seat, my heart pounding. I turned the key, the starter groaned, and then the big diesel roared to life, filling the shop with blue smoke and a beautiful noise. I eased the clutch out, shifted through the gears, and everything was smooth. The grinding was gone. I had done it. But I had lost 2 precious weeks of planting time. The ground was getting dry, and I had to work from sunup to sundown for the next 10 days to get my crops in, long after everyone else was done. That year, my yield was down by 10%. It was a loss I felt deep in my bones, a tuition payment for the school of self-reliance. Then came the boom. In 1972 and 73, the world changed again. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union sent crop prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been selling for a little over $1 a bushel, suddenly shot up to $2, then $3. For farmers, it was like finding oil in the backyard. The mood in Providence County turned from cautious optimism to outright gold rush fever. This was Rick Sterling's moment to shine. He was perfectly positioned. With his big equipment, he farmed more acres more efficiently than anyone. The soaring profits didn't just cover his loan payments, they gave him a massive surplus. And he did exactly what the banks and magazines were telling everyone to do. He leveraged it. He used his new equity to buy another 200 acres. He traded in the 1256 for a brand new international harvester, Warwastatic 6, an even bigger tractor with more horsepower and a quieter cab. He built 2 massive grain bins with a modern drying system, so he could store his corn and sell it when the prices were highest, instead of being forced to sell at harvest time like the rest of us. He was building an empire on a foundation of credit, and with prices this high, he looked like an absolute genius. The bank manager, Mr. Davison, would point to Rick as the model for the modern farmer. "Look at what Rick Sterling's doing," he'd tell other farmers who came in looking for an operating loan. "He's not afraid to invest in his business. He understands that you have to spend money to make money. Land values are only going one way, up. Grain prices are only going one way, up." The money was flowing. Farmers who had been driving 10-year-old pickups were suddenly showing up at church in brand new Cadillacs and Lincoln Continentals. Kitchens were being remodeled, family vacations were being taken to Florida. A wave of prosperity washed over the county, and it seemed like it would never end. I felt it too. Even with my smaller operation and older equipment, $3 corn meant I was making more money than my father ever had. My yields were steady, and with no debt payments to make, the profits went straight into my pocket. But I didn't see it the same way Rick and the others did. I saw it as a temporary gift, a cushion against the lean years that were sure to come. Farming is a cycle, a series of fat years and lean years. My father had taught me that. You save in the fat years, so you can survive the lean ones. So, while Rick was buying more land, I used the extra money to systematically improve what I already had. I put in another 5,000 feet of drainage tile in a low spot on the West 80, turning a soggy patch of ground into some of my most productive soil. I replaced the old wooden fence posts around the farmstead with new steel ones. I tore down the old leaning corn crib and built a sturdy new machine shed, a pole barn with a concrete floor and good lighting, so I wouldn't have to split a tractor in the dirt ever again. I bought a used, but well-maintained, Gleaner F combine. It wasn't the biggest or the newest, but it was a solid machine that I paid for with cash. To my neighbors, I looked like a man who lacked vision. "Can you believe it?" I heard one of them say at the co-op. "Arthur Jensen's got more cash than he knows what to do with, and he's spending it on fence posts. He could have bought that quarter section north of him, but he let some guy from the next county get it." They saw me as a failure, a man who was afraid to take a risk when the getting was good. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't go to the bank and leverage my 160 acres to buy 300 more. They saw my discipline as fear. One afternoon in the fall of '74, I went to the bank to make the final payment on the original mortgage for the farmstead itself, a loan my father had taken out 30 years before. It was a proud day for me. I handed the check to Mr. Davison, a man with neatly combed hair and polished shoes. "Well, Arthur," he said, stamping the paperwork with a flourish, "congratulations. You are officially debt-free. A rare thing these days. He leaned back in his leather chair. But you know, this is an opportunity. With this farm as collateral, and with your profit margins, I could get you a line of credit for $500,000 tomorrow. Think about it. You could expand, modernize. Rick Sterling just took out another loan to buy that new four-wheel drive Steiger. The man is unstoppable. I'm happy with what I have, Mr. Davison, I said, folding my copy of the paid-in-full notice and putting it in my shirt pocket. I think I'll just stay put. He sighed, a look of pity on his face. Suit yourself, Arthur. But you're missing the boat. Interest rates are creeping up. Sure, they're at 10% now. But with inflation running the way it is, that's practically free money. They're not going to go any higher than this. As I stood up to leave, his phone rang. He picked it up. Rick. Just the man I was thinking of. Yes, the paperwork is all set for the new operating loan. Don't you worry about the rate. It's a variable rate, so it'll adjust. But like I said, the sky's the limit right now. This boom isn't ending anytime soon. I walked out of the bank and into the bright afternoon sun. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Variable rate, the sky's the limit. The words echoed in my head. I looked up at the clear blue October sky, but all I could see were dark clouds gathering on a distant horizon, clouds that no one else in Providence County seemed to notice at all. The wind was starting to shift, and I had a terrible feeling that a storm was coming. The good years, the years of $3 corn, didn't last. By 1977, the party was over. Prices had stagnated, while the cost of everything else, fuel, fertilizer, seed, kept climbing. The word inflation was on the news every night, a steady drumbeat of anxiety. The easy prosperity of the early 70s was drying up, leaving the ground hard and cracked. And then the rain stopped. The summer of 78 was a scorcher. The sky turned a pale, hazy white and stayed that way for weeks. The corn in the fields, which should have been shoulder-high and dark green by July, was stunted and pale, the leaves curling inward during the heat of the day as if in prayer for a single drop of water. The ponds shrank, their edges turning into cracked mud flats, and the creeks slowed to a trickle. You could feel the thirst of the land in your own throat. It was during that brutal summer that the first real cracks began to show in Rick Sterling's empire. He was running that massive four-wheel drive Steiger, pulling a 24-foot field cultivator day and night, trying to prepare his ground for fall wheat, kicking up clouds of dust so thick they looked like smoke from a fire. One afternoon, I saw it sitting dead in the middle of his biggest field, a giant green monument to frustration. A day later, the dealer's service truck was out there, two mechanics in clean coveralls scratching their heads. The talk at the diner was that a hydraulic pump had gone out. It wasn't a simple mechanical pump like the one on my 4020. It was a high-pressure, variable displacement piston pump, a piece of sophisticated engineering that had to be special ordered from the factory in Fargo. The tractor sat in that field for 8 days, a silent testament to the fact that progress came with a price. The bill for the part and the labor, they said, was over $4,000. $4,000 to fix a machine he was still making payments on. That same week, the water pump on my old Farm All M started to weep. A tiny drip of green coolant fell onto the dusty floor of my shop. I went to my workbench, found an old sheet of gasket paper, and traced the shape of the old one. Using a ball-peen hammer, I tapped out the bolt holes, smeared a thin layer of shellac on both sides, and bolted it back on. The whole job took me less than an hour and cost me nothing but a few cents worth of paper. The next morning, the M fired up on the second crank, ready for another day's work. I used it to cultivate my vegetable garden and mow the ditches, tasks too small for the 40-20, but essential to the farm. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. While Rick's $4,000 problem sat idle, my 50-cent solution was back in business. The drought broke in late August, with a series of violent thunderstorms that did more harm than good, flattening the weakened corn stalks and washing away what little topsoil was left. The harvest that fall was a disaster for everyone. Yields were down by half. For me, it was a painful loss. I tightened my belt, put off plans to repaint the barn, and knew we'd make it through. For Rick, it was catastrophic. He had payments to make not just on the land, but on the Steiger, the new 1466, the big grain bins, and a combine that was twice the size of my gleaner. He had built a massive, hungry machine that required a bumper crop and high prices just to feed itself. That year, it got neither. I saw him at the bank one morning. He was coming out of Mr. Davison's office, and his face was pale and drawn. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, worried line. He nodded at me, a quick, jerky motion, and hurried out the door, not meeting my eyes. The tide was going out, and Rick Sterling was beginning to feel the sand washing out from under his feet. The foundation of his empire wasn't black dirt and hard work. It was lines of credit and promissory notes, and the paper was starting to get wet. The storm that I had seen gathering on the horizon finally broke in the winter of 1979. It wasn't a storm of wind and rain, but of numbers on a ledger and voices on the radio. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate attempt to kill the runaway inflation that was strangling the country, jacked up interest rates. It was a move they called shock therapy, and it sent a jolt through the heart of rural America. The prime rate, the number that banks based all their loans on, went from 10% to 15%, then to 18%. Then, for a terrifying few months in 1981, it peaked at over 20%. For men like Rick Sterling, who had built their farms on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His loan payments, the ones Mr. Davison had assured him were manageable, didn't just increase, they exploded. An operating loan that had cost him 10% a year now cost him 20%. The cost of borrowing money doubled overnight, and his income had been cut in half by the bad harvest. Then came the second blow. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the president announced a grain embargo. Our biggest customer was suddenly cut off. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn prices didn't just drop, they collapsed, falling back to levels we hadn't seen since the 60s. At the same time, land values, which had been climbing for a decade, began to plummet. Farmers who had borrowed against the inflated value of their land suddenly found themselves owing more than their entire farm was worth. Providence County became a place of quiet desperation. The new pickups disappeared from the church parking lot, replaced by old, rusty farm trucks. The talk at the diner was no longer about expansion and new equipment. It was about restructuring debt and holding on for one more season. For sale signs began to pop up along the county roads like bitter weeds. First it was just a few, then it was a flood. Every week, the local paper was filled with auction notices. The same sad story of defeat I had witnessed at the Hemmings place a decade earlier, now playing out on a terrifying scale. Rick Sterling's fall was the hardest and the fastest. His name was the first one on the foreclosure list. The bank that had been his partner in prosperity became his executioner in the crisis. Mr. Davison, the man who had encouraged him to borrow and expand, no longer took his calls. The letters that arrived were on cold, official letterhead, filled with words like delinquent and liquidation. I would see Rick's equipment sitting in his yard, silent and gathering dust. He couldn't afford the diesel to run the Steiger, let alone the insurance payments. His wife, the pretty girl from the city, packed her bags and went back to her father. The new house they had built, the one with the fancy drapes, sat dark and empty most nights. Rick himself seemed to shrink. He lost weight, his shoulders slumped, and the confident swagger was replaced by a haunted, hunted look. He was a ghost on his own farm, wandering through the wreckage of his ambition. My own farm became an island. It wasn't easy. The low prices meant our income was a fraction of what it had been. Sarah and I lived frugally. We ate from our garden, canned our own vegetables, and patched our clothes. But we survived. The difference was the silence in our mailbox. There were no letters from the bank, no overdue notices, no threats of foreclosure. The roof over our heads was ours. The ground under our feet was ours. The old 4020 and the Farmall M in the shed were ours. Every morning I could walk out into my fields, and the only person I had to answer to was myself. In the midst of the worst agricultural crisis since the Great Depression, that simple fact felt like the greatest luxury in the world. I wasn't getting rich, but I was holding on. In the wreckage of the 1980s farm crisis, holding on was the only victory that mattered. The day of the Sterling auction was cold and grey, a raw Saturday in November of 1982. The sky spit a miserable, sleeting rain that turned the farmyard into a sea of mud. It was a perfect reflection of the mood. The crowd was different from the one at the Hemmings' sale all those years ago. There was no festive atmosphere, no sense of opportunity. There was just a grim, somber silence. These were not neighbors looking for a bargain. They were survivors picking through the bones of a fallen comrade, their faces etched with the terrifying thought that it could just as easily be them next. I stood near the back, just as I had before, but this time felt different. I wasn't just a spectator. I had come with a cashier's check in my pocket. Sarah and I had talked about it for weeks. The 80 acres of bottomland that Rick had bought from the Hemmings estate bordered my own property. It was good land, and if I was ever going to expand, this was the time and the place. It felt strange, profiting from another man's ruin. But it was the way of things. The land endured. It was only the men who worked it that came and went. The auctioneer started with the machinery. The big Steiger, its tires caked in mud, its windows streaked with grime, went for less than half of what Rick had paid for it. The 1466, his pride and joy, sold for a third of its value to a corporate farm from out of state. It was a bloodbath. Each fall of the hammer was like a nail in the coffin of Rick's dream. I saw him standing on the porch of the empty house, watching. He was a hollowed-out version of the man I had known. His clean denim was replaced by stained work clothes, his confident posture gone, replaced by a defeated slump. He held a coffee cup in his trembling hands, the steam rising up into the cold air. Our eyes met for a moment across the muddy yard. There was no animosity in his gaze, no pride left. There was only a profound and bottomless despair. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It was all I could offer. Acknowledgement. Witness. When the auctioneer moved on to the land, I stepped forward. He started with the home place, the 200 acres with the house and the new grain bins. It was a heavy parcel, mortgaged to the hilt. The bidding was slow, agonizing. It finally sold to the bank for the value of the outstanding loan. There was no profit. Nothing left for Rick. Then they came to the Hemmings 80. "A fine piece of bottom land, folks," the auctioneer chanted, his voice lacking its usual fire. "Joins up with the Jensen place to the east. Who'll start me at 500 an acre?" Silence. The price of land had fallen so far that no one wanted to risk it. 500 was half of what it had been valued at just 3 years prior. 500, folks, do I hear 500? I raised my hand. 500, I said, my voice steady. A few heads turned. Arthur Jensen, the man with the old tractors, the dinosaur. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. I've got 500 from Mr. Jensen. Who will give me 5 1/4? More silence. The cold rain dripped from the brim of my cap. No one else was going to bid. The bank just wanted to clear the property off its books. Sold! The auctioneer cried, his hammer falling with a sharp crack. To Arthur Jensen for $500 an acre. I had done it. I had doubled the size of my father's original farm, not with a bank loan or a variable rate, but with cash I had saved during the good years, cash I had earned with old, reliable iron. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound, sobering vindication. After I signed the paperwork in the back of a muddy pickup truck, I walked over to the porch where Rick was still standing. He didn't look up as I approached. "Rick," I said softly. He finally raised his eyes. They were empty. "You got a good piece of land, Art," he mumbled. "Always was." "I'm sorry it came to this," I said, and I meant it. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You told me, didn't you? Right at the start. You told me about the bank. I called you a dinosaur." He shook his head, looking out at the crowd, at the strangers hauling away his life's work. Turns out the dinosaurs were the only ones smart enough to survive the asteroid. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This isn't much," I said, holding it out to him. "But maybe it'll help you get a start somewhere else." He looked at the envelope, then at me, his eyes filling with tears for the first time. He didn't take it. "Why, Art? After everything I said." "I laughed at you." "Because we're neighbors," I said, "and this whole thing—" I gestured to the auction, the mud, the whole sorry mess. "It's bigger than you and me. You just got caught in the storm." He finally took the envelope, his calloused fingers closing around it. "Thank you, Arthur," he whispered. I heard later that he left the county, went back to the city to work for his father-in-law. I never saw him again. In the years that followed, things slowly began to change. The farm crisis eased, but it left deep scars on the landscape. Half the farms in Providence County were gone, consolidated into huge, faceless corporate holdings. But the Jensen farm was still there. And my shop, the one where I had split my 40-20, became a kind of community center. Men who had traded in their old simple tractors for new, complicated ones found they couldn't afford the dealer's repair bills. They started showing up at my door. "Art, my clutch is out on my Oliver, and the dealer wants $1,000 just to look at it." "Art, you got a spare carburetor for an old case?" I never turned anyone away. I'd help them find used parts, show them how to make a gasket, teach them the logic of a simple diesel engine. We'd work together, our hands covered in the same grease, breathing life back into the old iron that everyone had been so quick to discard. They stopped calling me a dinosaur. They started calling me for advice. I'm an old man now. My son David runs the farm. He uses bigger equipment than I ever did, but it's all bought used, and it's all paid for in cash. The farm is 3 times the size it was when my father had it, a patchwork of parcels bought for fair prices from families who had to get out. It's a good living. The other day, I was out in the machine shed. The old Farmall M still sits in the corner, its red paint faded, but its engine sound. My grandson, a boy of 10 named Michael, was with me. "Grandpa," he asked, running his small hand over the tractor's fender, "why do you keep this old thing?" "David says it's not big enough to do any real work anymore." I smiled and wiped a bit of grease from the steering wheel with my thumb. I looked at the boy, at his bright, curious eyes, and I saw the future. I saw the next link in the chain. "Michael," I said, putting my arm around his shoulder. "This tractor taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. It's not about horsepower. It's not about air conditioning or having a radio in the cab. It's about what you own and what owns you." I pointed to the engine block, to the simple, solid casting of iron. "Every nut and bolt on this machine," I told him, "is paid for. It doesn't have a loan against it. It doesn't have a monthly payment. It doesn't owe a single penny to a man in a suit in a bank downtown. When a storm comes, and a storm always comes, this is the kind of thing that will see you through. This old tractor, Michael, is free. And in this life, there's nothing more valuable than that." He looked from the tractor back to me, and I could see in his young face that he was beginning to understand. The old red tractor wasn't just a piece of machinery. It was a monument. It was the story of our family, a story of survival, written not in ink, but in grease and steel, and the rich, black dirt of the heartland.